Next, approval of tonight's agenda.
Move approval.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Next is the approval of the minutes from the October 17th, 2018 meeting.
Can't remember back that far.
Yeah.
Move to approve.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those who want to abstain?
Abstain. I was
Abstain.
absent.
Abstain. I was absent as well. Motion carries. Next up is the public forum. If there's anyone in the audience tonight that would like to speak on an item that's not on the agenda, now's the time to do so. Hearing none, we'll move on to item number 6, the zoning text amendment regarding short-term rentals for multifamily apartment buildings.
Good evening. This item is coming before you. You may recall that you talked about short-term rentals several times. The last being September 19th, when we brought a draft ordinance to you. And that particular item looked at single family, and then you had requested that two family be included. So that was the ordinance that then went for a review to the council. We did not take it as a first reading. We took it as a staff report because we felt it had been too long since they had discussed it and really that they hadn't had a lot of time to discuss it at length. So consequently, they did meet twice, 2 different council meetings to discuss and ask questions of staff, and we brought information back. And at the November 13th meeting, they directed staff to put together an ordinance that would allow short-term rentals in apartment units. That was a substantive change to what we had previously looked at doing and the way we had approached it. So it took a little bit of time to figure out how we might draft language that staff was comfortable with, that also fit within the variety of zoning districts within the city. And right now, you may recall that short-term rentals, we had several categories. We had the hosted home share and the home share that could be in a home while that was the primary residence of the property owner. Vacation rentals were a little different item, and that was something that could be investment property. So in looking at that, obviously the first category is the home share and hosted home share. That use is an accessory use, whereas the use of a vacation rental under short-term lodging becomes more of a primary use. Staff had concerns that, well, I don't want to jump the gun, that's down further in the agenda. So the first question was the general discussion of allowing short-term rentals in apartment dwellings. And the way that the ordinance, the zoning ordinance defines apartment buildings is 3 or more dwelling units in a building. So that term in our zoning ordinance also includes condominiums. Condominiums are a type of ownership. They're not a type of building. So sometimes that can be confusing. Within our rental occupancy, the way that a letter of compliance is granted is it is given per address. So an entire building that's rental apartments will be granted an LOC. That's different than a single family or 2 family or condominium, because those are each addressed individually. So it's consistent in the sense that it's by address, but whether it's per unit or whether it's per building Or another way to approach apartments might be to do it at per parcel, and have a license that would be granted for the entire parcel of apartments. When we first started looking at the short-term rentals, and the council had asked us about apartments, we came back to them with some additional data that I don't believe you had seen, but it talked about this last graphic. Oops, got to turn it on. This last graphic just shows the types of multifamily STR units that we could determine at a point in time when we looked at Airbnb listings. And that was from October. And at one day in October, we determined that there were 9 apartments within the RH zoning district, 2 condominiums within RH, and 5 within UCRM. So at that particular time, we found that there were 30% of the STRs were within the UCRM district. Part of our analysis also was that in looking at apartments, even though rental apartments are generally associated with higher density zoning districts, when we looked at the inventory of currently licensed rental apartments in Ames, that there are a number of apartments within the RL district as well as RM and UCRM. And those districts, in some cases, are substantially different than the RH zoning district. So our analysis and conclusion was that apartments in a higher density district could be treated different than an apartment within a lower density district, that we would want to look at the context and the compatibility, and we wouldn't want to exempt them from licensure for vacation rental when a single family home has to have licensure and a special use permit and so forth. This is a map just to show you. Well, first let me put this zoning map up. This is the city, the entire city. Within,
If you want to zoom out, you go up top.
within the city, the only areas that have UCRM are in the area close to downtown here. As I'll show you on this map here. So this was just this is not short-term rentals. These are apartments that are registered as rentals, period, that are within UCRM. And currently within that district, you cannot build new apartments without special permitting and so forth. You have to have special considerations to do it. So, so there were some concerns that if we, were to allow licensing of or exempt apartments from licensing or from a special use permit, especially in an area like this, that it could have a major effect on the residential character. This is a map showing the registered apartments in RM and FSRM. Now, what the Old Town District, the overlay zone in this area, has the overlay over the RM zoning. But you can see there's really not a lot of areas with RM or FSRM per se, but there are quite a few apartments that are licensed within that. If you look at the table that was in your agenda item, that within FSRM and RM, there's an estimated 838 apartments. And within this downtown area, within the single-family conservation district overlay, there's 207. So I just want you to understand that relationship as we move through this agenda item further. So we believe that given the variation in the location and context of apartments, one solution would be to allow short-term rentals in apartments, but to vary the licensing requirements for apartments by district to accomplish the city's objectives. And rather than exempt rental apartments from licensure altogether, the licensing approach could be modified, and it could be modified in various ways. One way could be to do it on a per building or address basis, or another way would be, as I mentioned, to do it on a parcel basis, where you still have the landlord or you still have the property owner submit for vacation rental license for his development. And so that's on file. If it's a higher density area that would be exempt from having a special use permit, then they would not need to go through the special use permit process. However, if it's in a lower density area where there's less intensity of apartments, a special use permit would still be required. That's just one option for one way to approach it. Condominiums would continue to need to be licensed individually because they're owned as individual units. So the special use permit is intended to review unique circumstances about compatibility, and that's our concern, is the context of the neighborhood and compatibility and a possible need to monitor the use. Another concern that we had was that short-term rentals can reduce the availability of housing for the longer-term purpose, which is household living. And that has been found to be a situation that sometimes these short-term rentals do reduce what's available for long-term renting. And we do not want a complex that's intended for housing students or for long-term household living to then become operated like a hotel or a motel where a majority of the units are come and go all the time. That would not be appropriate in any of these residential districts. And so the way we were proposing to approach that would be that the greater of one unit or up to 30% of the total units on a parcel could be granted as short-term rentals. And what that means is then if you have a parcel with 6 units or less, you would be granted 1 short-term rental. But if it's greater than that, then you would in no circumstance be allowed to have more than 30%. So with that, it's our recommendation that you approve alternative 1. And the alternative 1 is that, and one thing I didn't really highlight is that the home share, which is considered an accessory use, could be permitted with no license within these apartments, because we don't know how we would really monitor that anyway. And, the vacation rental as a primary use would be restricted to 30% of the units. And the special use permit would be required for vacation rental in non-high density or commercial areas. So that's staff's recommendation. I'm sure you have questions.
Mr. Chairman, how did you come up with the 30%?
Well, typically an accessory use has to be less than 50%.
Uh-huh.
And when we looked at the purposes of the apartments, we felt that 30% would be a good number. It's not really, it seemed like it met the criteria of continuing the main use as apartments for household living. But yet, it felt like it was a good balance. But is it the perfect number? Well, that would be for you to decide in your recommendation.
I guess what occurs to me is in some of the larger complexes, 30% could be a fairly high number of units. As I live on the far south side of town, and those two very large buildings are going up. If a third of those were vacation rentals, that could be a very large number of people. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm very supportive of this, but 30% seems on the high end, at least for large facilities. Just an observation.
Yeah, I live out close to Mortensen, and there's a lot of apartments up there, and we have a couple of hotels there, and they'd be competing directly with them. And so I guess what I'm asking is that the 30% is not based on any research.
No,
Okay,
because
yeah.
Just
actually,
arbitrary number somebody.
I do not know of a community. I did not have a prototypical community to go off of for this directive from the council. So,
Okay, wouldn't it be better for the community to promote more hotels than having something compete with the hotels that we have here right now? It's, like you said, 30% seems awfully high.
Excuse me. To me, 30% seems high for the large complexes, but for a smaller complex, maybe not so much. Maybe those percentages could be stair-stepped based on the size of the property, or I don't know. I'm just asking the question. I think personally, it's another form of business, and I don't want to get into the discussion of whether we favor hotels over small business Airbnb approaches or whatever. That's beyond where I was going with it. I'm just more concerned about the volume,
The volume of transit,
particularly for the very large
Right.
properties.
I think our only real concern didn't really scale to the size of the property. It's just whether the principal use, meaning typically that's 51% of the primary
true.
use, is what it's supposed to be.
Mhm.
Short-term lodging is not housing. So we didn't feel 49%, 51% was really a good split either. That's why we went down to this 30% number. We didn't really approach it in thinking that there would be a larger complex, just because it was a larger complex, would be treated any different than a smaller complex, just from a percentage basis. Once you decide that they can't all be. I mean, one of the options is it's just not a regulated use, it's just permitted. And we're not involved in any licensing, or we're not involved in any permitting process. It's just the use of an apartment building can be for any term of lease or rent.
Certainly.
And, we're offering that there should be some limit on that to maintain housing stock. Now, how many apartment complexes are going to want to go this route and have
At
any
that volume,
substantial
yeah.
amount? We don't know. That'll be a good test question for how that works.
who drove this question towards us? Just
City council. City council's directive was to permit them in apartments, period.
Yep.
And to draft an ordinance that would allow that. So having not gone through all the options of what that would mean, that's why we're here tonight back with you as a new concept, trying to talk out what are the ins and outs of allowing apartments to be used as temporary or short-term lodging. So that's one of the alternatives is to just allow them by right, be permitted, and the city's not involved.
And again, the short-term rental is limited to 30 days, 60.
No, so by definition, the average length of stay in household living is 60 days. So an apartment can do month-to-month leases right now,
right?
That's not forbidden. We don't really get into the business of monitoring leases. It's just if the average tenant is there for more than 60 is how we look at it now. Short-term lodging is going to be based on having to pay hotel motel tax, meaning the stay is less than 31 days. So short-term lodging is a defined use where the stay is less than 31 days. And that's the definition we use with the single family and two family homes. And that would be applicable here as well.
It's just going to be a compliance nightmare for somebody's going to have to monitor this.
So originally, why they were not included was city staff didn't believe we needed to be involved in trying to assess subletting and monitoring how tenants and landlords use their rental agreements and leases. It was easier for us just to say it wasn't allowed. So if we found a listing online, we could contact the property and say, this is happening, this isn't permitted, and not get involved in how those relationships are set up. Council was concerned that it is happening and maybe it's appropriate to allow it. So bring it into the fold of how would we or do we want to regulate it? So there wasn't illegal activity, it's permitted, and then how or is it licensed with us? So that's one reason why we're saying the home share, which is accessory. We don't want to be involved in trying to sort out if someone's on a weekend letting their roommates gone and they have agreed to let somebody in. We don't want to get into those relationships. So many units are 4 or 5 bedroom, individually rented bedrooms. We don't want to police people's tenant relationships. So that's a big concern on both sides of this, either allow it or don't allow it, but city staff doesn't want to be involved in tenant relationships.
But again, how are you going to, is there a way to monitor it?
Well,
once you approve it?
It's the same as 1 and 2 family homes. If it depends on how aggressive the city council wants us to be in monitoring through websites about what's posted and what's licensed, and how do they want us to be proactive on going after those. And for us, it needs to be about the property owner. We do not want to be policing individual apartments. So however this is set up, if we have rules about what percentage is rented or anything like that, it's going to be the landlord's responsibility to monitor the behavior of their tenants. A citation will go to a property owner, will not go to a tenant. So that would change the lease structures. People will have to address this in their leases with their tenants, knowing that they can be held accountable for the actions of their tenants. And that's the same as the rental code. Certain things that happen on a property, the landlord's held accountable for what the tenant does. Their rental certificate's up for renewal, not the tenant's lease when you get citations from the city. So that it is kind of a complex issue on how involved are we, how involved do we want to be, what's the appropriate balance.
We don't really know the distribution, right? Of where, I mean, I looked at Airbnb today at a map, and obviously there's a lot of apartments already being leased or put up for lease. Whether they're spare bedrooms or not is probably, I didn't dig deeply, but they seem to be scattered across, though the obvious concentration is next to campus that I saw. So I know October you guys looked at this a little bit, but there's not a sense now of is this geography the same as it was, expanded, it shifted at all?
I don't know that we have.
When I've looked at it, it seems rather dispersed. That it really isn't just concentrated around the university. It's rather dispersed around town. But it, of course, day to day, it could be different one day from another too, as to what's showing up.
Sure.
We definitely haven't seen a concentration issue. Like when we actually go look at rentals around campus and you come up with 60% rental concentrations in some of those neighborhoods, we have not seen any obvious data like that the few times we've taken snapshots of information. So I think what we've tried to boil it down to is essentially kind of 2 or 3 yes or no questions. Are you in favor of allowing the use in apartments? Yes or no? If yes, then the question becomes, do you want to treat apartments in these lower density zoning districts different than apartments in higher density areas? And then the third question would be, do you have an interest in restricting a percentage within an apartment building to maintain it as an apartment building versus operating as a hotel? So that's kind of the way we've thought through it as a series of 3 questions.
I don't know if I'm agreeing with Carol or not, but I think 30% is much too high. And I think 10% would be a more realistic. It'd be used to maybe fill up their empty apartments. You know,
On the other hand, if, I'm just thinking out loud here, if the council were to say 30% feels okay to us as a top limit, and were to ensure that staff collected data on the actual use, particularly in some of the larger complexes for, say, a year, 18 months, to see, was that 30% real, or is it always just going to run between 5 and 8%? And that might be a data collection nightmare. I understand. It's just hard to make that kind of a determination without any data.
right? But it'd be easier to move it up than it would be bring it back down if a number of these bigger ones decided that they're going to have 30%.
That's a thought.
Like you say, if you start out at a lower level and then work your way up, if there is a need, if you
Demand.
go at 10% and see there really is not a need, then 10% is a good level. But if you go 30% and you say, oh man, that's not going to work out, and then say a couple of these buildings down in Mertenson already has 30% out. It's going to be tough to tell them, hey, you can't do this now. And then take away 30% of their, or 20% of their business.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be fair to them.
How would the city ensure that the 30% threshold wasn't surpassed?
It would probably be either complaint driven, or if we did have a service that was giving us address data, then we could see based on the addresses how many short-term rentals are in concentrated areas. It's really kind of new territory because our analysis back when we did analysis, the primary, obviously right now we don't permit short-term or licensed short-term rentals to start with. So it's a little unclear as to how it would move forward. If it would take off exponentially, or if it would continue kind of the trend that it's on. But back in October, the primary users were in single family homes. But of course, if we open it up to apartments, then that's an area that we don't really have data on right now. So it's uncharted for us to know the implications. All we can look at is what we know that could be possible concerns based on compatibility and that kind of thing.
It kind of turned into a nuisance issue, would be where the police power would kick in, it sounds like, for the most part.
Well, what we did decide since we visited you is most of the authority is not going to be in the zoning code. It would be in a separate licensing chapter. So it really wouldn't be a nuisance. It'd be whether you're operating with or without a license or exceeding the operating parameters, then you're subject to a municipal citation for not having a license.
But if it's licensed by building, say there's 30 units, 30% would be 10 units roughly.
It will
You'd have to somehow know if
probably
there were
have
11.
We'll probably be doing this by property, not by building.
Okay.
Because we have to tie this back to a property owner.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay.
So it
So complex, essentially, multiple buildings.
probably,
Yeah.
yeah, that's probably the best way. It'll probably be by property if that's where we end up.
What do you mean by property and not building?
So if you have 5 apartment buildings on one property, we're going to regulate 30% of the total of the 5 buildings, not 30% of each building would probably be the approach.
And when you say the property, it is a development that's located on a single parcel?
Yes.
Right. Because the property owner would have to apply for the license, the tenants can't. So a tenant can't come in and we're not going to register 30 tenants out of 100 apartment units to do this. The property owner is going to come in and register the property for vacation rentals with whatever terminology or standards we have in place for it.
Unless we say that it needs to be done by building, in which case the property owner,
I'm just saying, I don't think that's where we'll go because that's not, although rental certificates are done that way, I don't think that's how we would want to monitor things.
what's the hitch?
I'm not sure.
And when you say,
The other, the other issue is condos. There is it again 30% of the units in a development that are condos, or is it 30% of the units in a building? That's where I would want to go back to the property and look at the development. Now, HOAs can have control on what their members do, but a lot of apartments are condominiumized for property tax purposes. So I would want to look at the overall complex more than a building.
The reason I'm trying to drill into that is you would think of it as an impact issue. So an impact of 10 short-term rentals on a property versus who owns it. Whether it's a condominium or whether it is with condominium that is individually owned, or whether it is an apartment complex that's owned by a single property management. To me, it is more of an impact issue of how many units, what kind of impact they create with noise, with traffic, with any nuisance, or any other attention that it might need. So the more number of short-term rental units that are added, irrespective of if it's owned by a single person or multiple people. To me, the ownership doesn't really concern as much as what the impact of the number of units that are short-term rentals and the kind of attention they might need in case there is an issue.
I don't
So
think
to
I'm
me, that
disagreeing
approach
with that.
feels a little bit more easier to wrap my head around rather than ownership.
So I'm not sure. I don't think I'm disagreeing. I think we typically regulate property, not buildings. So our mindset as staff is to consider the boundaries of the project and not worry about one of 5 buildings being different than another. Because
Sure.
we're still going to be 30% of the total
Okay.
within
So
rounding errors of.
just to hypothesize or to try and do like an example, if there is there's a property which has, say, 2 buildings, 10 properties in each, 10 units in each, you would do 30% of 20 units. And I would assume that on that parcel, by and large, both those properties would either be all condos or both the properties would be single management owned.
Mhm.
So it shouldn't be an issue in terms of ownership because ownership's going to be the same. You wouldn't probably have 10 units of one building being a single property management and the other 10 being condos. So you wouldn't get into that sort of complex
Correct.
necessarily. I don't know if there are examples out there that have that kind of situation, but by and large, you probably wouldn't have that.
Right.
So to me, it feels like if you do like you're citing 30, and even I feel 30% is on the upper edge. I would probably think of it as a smaller percentage. But if we did whatever that X percentage of total number of units on that property, to me, that becomes easier to track on multiple levels. It would be easier to track from your monitoring side, depending on what kind of monitoring mechanism it's put in place. It's easier to figure out whether you have 10 units that are being used as short-term rentals or there are 11. If it's going over the threshold, it's easier. You have a licensing procedure for everything, and that's the other thing I would think might be helpful, is instead of not having licenses for some and having licenses for the other, we do a special use permit for everything. So then it's easier to track.
That's not,
That's the second piece. But to
Yeah.
me, it feels like the building or the number of units in a building might be more helpful to figure out what the impact of that particular short-term rental density.
I don't think we see it that way. I think if a landlord in 1 month wants to have, out of 20 units, have all 6 in one building, and in some other month of the year, it's split 3 and 3, and it's still 30%, we don't care.
Okay.
The boundary of the site is the same, and they're going to have to decide how they can rent the property and how their tenants are going to be interacting with the short-term rentals.
I think the externalities would be exactly the same,
That's how I'm
Right.
looking at it
Just
at the
traffic
property line.
generated.
Yeah.
regardless if it's one building or another.
Because if we're going to allow it, it's going to be about which apartment can't I rent. So now I'm going to put it up as Airbnb. Some people will probably design projects and set it aside that way. Others will probably do what someone said. If I can't rent it, I'm going to put it up on Airbnb and at least make revenue on weekends until I get a lease. And once we get there, we're fine with the flexibility of it being in whichever building or what the concentration level
Well,
is.
going back to the Mortensen buildings, say there's 50 apartments in each building. There's at least 5 there. Out of 250 apartments, it's 75 that can be gone at 30% rate. That'd be one whole building
Mhm.
if they wanted to set it aside that way.
Mhm.
And that would be a hotel. If you walks like a duck, talks like a duck, it's a duck. Yes. So
I'm not disagreeing. I think to us, it doesn't matter. Once you allow it, whether it's spread out or concentrated, we don't see a difference. The externalities start at the property line. We're not worried about internal issues.
Because any internal nuisance complaints would be
Mhm.
unit to unit,
Yeah, it'd be a
right?
landlord issue.
Regardless of
Now,
outside.
Yeah.
And that would be a tenant complaining to another tenant or to a landlord or condo owner complaining to a neighboring condo owner.
just like in a hotel,
Yeah.
room next to
Same
you, call the
situation.
front desk now. No front desk.
I'm just thinking like, the scenarios in which this happens. It strikes me like enrollment is now declining. We've hit a threshold. Some of these buildings are not rented. It's perfect timing, right? Suddenly they're going to start. And you imagine during football, like suddenly the football team's good.
the Iowa game, yeah.
There's going to be more demand. You could probably make a significant chunk of your yearly revenue holding apartments for
7
weekend.
weekends, yeah.
Yeah. Where I would guess that you're going to see some of these closer apartment buildings, Stadium View and some of these others that have recently been constructed, start to see units set aside specifically for this because, I don't know what they charge for weekend rental, but I could imagine it would be substantial.
And that'll take away the students' ability to rent them too.
Well, yeah, I mean, but there's already vacancies and there's going to be more as the
Oh,
enrollment
yes.
continues to decline. And so it's kind of interesting that this is happening right now at this precise moment.
I guess I'm concerned about
So,
changing the whole flavor of a neighborhood or, a complex.
well, I mean, that's a good question, I think. I mean, I imagine that most of this will probably be concentrated in certain complexes, but I could be wrong. I don't know. We don't have data to really
Right.
talk about one. It's just a guess, just a hunch.
Some landlords just aren't going to do it. Others are. We just don't know how that's going to.
I think they're going to do what you said. They're going to rent units they can't rent.
That's where it'll start.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll see what they can do.
Yeah. And if it's lucrative, then suddenly they're going to say, all right,
Exactly.
we're going to pull more back and
Exactly.
keep these aside for, football weekends or
But we-
graduation, other kinds of.
But do we want them to be able to pull more back?
Well, I think we have to
In the
be realistic,
licensing,
though.
yeah. So the issue of can you take it away when it's a license, you have no vested right to anything. You're going to have a license for a year. We change the parameters at the end of a year. You don't get that license back after a year. There's no vested right to anything through a licensing program. So it's not the same as zoning where you allow someone to build 20 units. You can't take those units away. This is how you can use that unit. And if the city wants to change and 30% is the wrong number or whatever number it is, you're not truly taking anything away from anybody because they didn't have something that they had a vested right to.
It appears with university enrollment trends right now that we either are or are approaching being overbuilt for rentals. And I don't see how that trend is going to change significantly over the short term. It may stabilize, but I don't think it's going to change personally. Having
I
been in
don't-
the higher ed business for a while.
So I don't think we're going into a housing conversation. That's not the point.
I know, and it's
I
completely
think
different, but
staff-
but when we
staff would
think
not
about
have the
utilization.
perspective that we're overbuilt on rental properties. That is not the city planning department's perspective. Yes, there's a soft market this year when
That's right.
1,500 bedrooms came online
And there's
and there
more
was a
coming.
drop of 1,000 customers. That's a soft spot.
Yep.
That was predictable for the last year. But to say that the whole housing,
And I don't know, I'm just making a citizen's observation that it appears that there may be a fairly large number of empty units right now.
I would not say very large.
But,
It's an appropriate vacancy rate.
but I
for the
don't
first time in
have
6
the
years.
data to base that upon other than eyeballs.
So I think we got to get back on
I agree.
the target of our short-term rentals appropriate in apartments or not, and then what are the parameters that go with it?
Maybe we can go question by
I think
question,
that's a
like
good idea.
Kelly had mentioned. So the first one you mentioned was whether it's appropriate to have short-term rentals in apartment units.
And I think we
So maybe we
focused mostly on the vacation rental. I think the idea of the home share, which is accessory,
Mhm.
we have no issue with that if that's allowed across the board. Most of this conversation, I believe, has been about the principal vacation rental.
Can you explain a little bit on how that home share works for apartment units? What
It's-
does that mean? Just to clarify.
It's just going to be permitted that you can, if the primary resident lives there, they can have a guest and charge rent to somebody to stay the weekend with them.
It says owner not required to be present in a home share.
Correct. It's the resident is,
So the owner still uses it as primary residence, but at the time of renting it for a short-term rental, that the owner does not
For it-
need to be living in the apartment.
so for an apartment, the owner can't live in the mall. So that notion won't apply. Really, the idea of a home share is we're not going to worry about someone that has incidental use of their apartment to have a guest stay with them on the weekend or for some period of time. That's a tenant landlord sublease guest stay policy relationship that the city doesn't need to be in. So either it's not allowed at all, so we can tell the landlord stop, or we need to permit it. We can't be in the middle on that one.
I don't know if I still get it. What does home share for apartment mean? Give me an example of what that
There's not an
situation
owner
is.
that lives in an apartment.
Correct. So it's a
At
two-bedroom. There's no owner living in the
You're renting an
apartment
so
right?
There's no owner that lives in the apartment.
At all.
at all.
It's not required to live there at all throughout the year.
Correct. In the single-family home, it's different, but in an apartment, you have to get
How
out of
is
the
that-
ownership model.
How is that different than from the vacation rental?
So what she's looking at is that we didn't correct that second row on the table to say owner required to be present. That's the issue. That should not have been there. We should have deleted that row.
Say that again.
So on the attachment,
Yeah,
this row,
yeah.
that should have been deleted.
Or it doesn't
The
need,
owner present, I see why you're confused. That should not have been there.
That's just for single-family properties, right?
Well, we modified this table with underlining and some other things to represent how apartments would be treated differently than single family. That's a row that we should have
Okay.
struck out,
okay.
but we missed that when we were changing things.
Okay.
So I can,
I'm comfortable speaking to the first question. I am comfortable with including apartments as part of this conversation for short-term rentals. How many and all that, that's different, but I am comfortable with the concept that they should be included.
So should we take this in steps and
That's what I know is suggesting,
And,
yes.
To,
vote on if that's what we want, and then take another step, see what we want? Or I don't know if it has to be a formal vote or just a show of hands or.
you're going to make a recommendation. So you have to decide if you're making 3 recommendations or 1 recommendation, I guess. You guys have to decide
One
that.
motion or 3 motions?
Correct.
Okay.
what would be helpful to you? It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter to me.
Do you want to do
I-
3 different motions then? Would it be
I'm-
easier to track?
if we're talking about breaking alternative one into three motions, essentially, it doesn't matter.
I mean, it kind of already is.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of, yeah, because number one, we just talked about home shares and accessory use, fine. Number two, vacation rental is a primary use. That's the 30% threshold.
So now we're on B.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I guess I would also agree with the allowance of short-term rentals in apartment units. And I think to me, it's more of why. And I see it just coming from apartments in a college town or in a university town. You have 2 or 3 months in summer when most students are not around. So those apartments can become vacant. So far, I think in Ames, we've had that 11-month lease cycle. So a lot of times,
12,
It's
12 months.
I mean,
12-month
just
lease
because
cycle,
they're
so-
vacant doesn't mean-
364 days.
yeah, so
Move out
I
there.
think property managers might not have had to worry about it in the past, but I feel like and I do agree, there are a lot more apartments now on the market than what we've seen in, say, 10 years back. So the likelihood of some apartments being vacant in summer is higher, at least from a school's perspective. So following that logic, to me, it makes sense to allow property managers the option of putting it for short-term rentals to compensate for that 2 or 3 month period where there might be a vacancy from a school closing perspective.
So there typically isn't a vacancy because you're
I know.
signing a lease.
Exactly.
It's
So
tenant.
I
they
agree
would want
with
to
you.
get out of their lease and sublet in the summer.
to me, that would have been perfectly the justification, say 8 or 10 years back. But I feel like there are a lot more apartments on the market right now. Even now, if I go out and see, there are a lot more advertising signs which say monthly leases available, which you wouldn't see in Ames a few years back. So to me, that feels like that is probably one of the reasons that speaks to some of that vacancy issue, maybe, is they're trying to bring in more people. So to me, the bottom line being that to me, that is the place that I'm coming from, agreeing to be on, like, allowing property managers to have short-term rentals. I'm coming from a school closing perspective where you may have vacancy more than others, which I would like to tie to the number of days that a unit can be short-term rental later in the motions down the line. But that's kind of where I'm bringing that piece from.
So you agree?
I agree.
Do we want to move on to the discussion of the threshold percentage?
Sure.
I'm for 10%
Okay.
because it's, like I said, it's easier to,
Across the board. So an eight.
yeah, well,
So an eightplex, you couldn't have one.
if you have an eightplex,
That's true.
I know this is getting complicated now. You
We
could always, you could always say minimum,
Round it off to the closest.
maximum, not minimum, maximum. You know, if you have a 10-plex, you can have one, or, you know,
You round it off to the closest, I would think, with the minimum being at least one.
1 or 10% would
10%.
cover everything.
How complicated would that be to institute some sliding scale like that?
It wouldn't be.
I wouldn't call that a sliding scale. That's-
It's just a 10%
Oh, you're saying
across the
not, you're
board.
not, no change, just 10% in general?
Mhm.
Or one, whichever is.
One,
One or
Greater.
10%,
Or
whichever's
10%.
more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
that would,
I'm okay with that.
That's not an issue.
that, so an 8-plex could have one.
Okay.
Mhm.
A 5-plex could have one.
3-plex could have one.
Correct.
Yes.
That would give them the option,
Option of
the
it.
the smaller guy,
Mhm.
the option of filling that vacancy
Mhm.
that the big guy would have too.
Okay.
Right.
So I guess
Sure.
that's the only way I can see them being halfway fair,
So
1 or
10%.
10%.
Okay. I mean, I'm fine. The number
I don't know
feels a
what the
little
right number
arbitrary.
is, yeah.
And I don't need, it's,
You know,
You know,
not sure what,
Personally, I don't
works or
think we should
not.
change it. The apartments should be apartments, period, but I take it the city council wants it. And they'll probably carry with votes here that you guys all want this option for them. But,
Yeah.
you know, if it's going to be an option, then I think 10% is more realistic than 30%. Or, excuse me, 1 or 10%.
I would be agreeable to that.
What?
I would agree with that.
So we'll mark that as 10%. The next piece of this is the special use permit by zoning district.
I feel there shouldn't be an exemption. I feel like special use permit should be required again across the board. Just so, again, across the board for apartments. And since we're talking only about apartments right now, across the board for all zoning districts. Within that too, I think there was RL, which was mentioned
As non-exempt.
as apartments are non-conforming use within RL. So I would say no. No short-term rentals in there
In the URLs.
because apartments are non-conforming use right now. So any apartments that are currently in the RL district are already non-conforming.
So they,
When you give them something like this, it intensifies or expands that non-conformance in my mind. So I would say no to RL, no to short-term rentals in RL completely
for apartments in RL.
for apartments in
A
RL.
single family
No,
RL.
no, not, yes, just for apartments. We're
Okay.
talking only apartments. So to RL, I would say no. To UCRM and OSFC, it says UCRM zoning districts are permitted. Apartments within UCRM are permitted only as pre-existing use. And with OSFC, existing apartments are considered as conforming use, but construction of new apartments is restricted.
Sort of.
So I don't know if there's some form of limited.
Sounds like there's not going to be any new apartments in those districts though.
Maybe we can, I don't know if we can add in something where it says that you could, in these two, UCRM and OSFC, you limit short-term rentals to apartments that are existing or constructed by a certain date, which is, I don't know if it's the adoption of.
I just don't know that you have to do that. I mean, that you can't. So in UCRM, if you had a 4-unit apartment building, technically you could take down that 4-unit apartment building and rebuild it. That's legal under the pre-existing definition versus RL when it's non-conforming, you can't take it down and bring it back. I guess I don't see a difference.
So if an apartment building, say in UCRM, where it's permitted only as pre-existing use, apartments are permitted only as pre-existing use. If say a 4 or 6 plex for some reason was destroyed beyond a certain point in time, certain percentage, and it's taken down, you would allow new construction of a new apartment there just because there was a pre-existing apartment.
Yeah.
And my point being, at that point, you want to start getting that district in conformance with what the standards for that district are. So any new construction probably should not have,
That would be
Short-term
considered
rentals.
conforming, though. That's the difference. It's a weird notation for Ames, but that is considered conforming. It's not the same as a non-conforming use.
okay. Okay, I will let that battle go. But other than that, as long as we have, RL is no, because there are no apartments allowed. I would say we have annual licensing for everything else, or have a special use permit for everything else.
That would be two different things though, right?
Yeah, that's two different things. So the vacation rental would always have a license with what staff's proposed.
Okay,
The question is that.
I will
whether
take that
special use
back.
permit-
I will reframe it that all of them should have a special use permit. And my point being that it's easier to track your percentage that we have 10% or 1 when you have a special use permit. And you can put in conditions on your special use permit as to what to expect the apartment.
So the consistency.
Yes. And it's easier to manage noise, traffic. If it becomes a nuisance, then the city can go back and say, okay,
So
it's revoked.
through the conversation of so the reason that we recommended special use for single family was to deal with unique conditions of a single family block, because we didn't put a concentration standard in or anything like that. So at some point, too many on a block's probably not appropriate in single family neighborhoods. So the issues of nuisances, noise, and all that, we've embedded all that in the licensing process. If you get cited for certain kinds of offenses, you can't renew your license. You won't be able to operate the short-term rental in the way we set up the single family section. So I'm not sure that the special use permit gives us any more authority about a nuisance property in an apartment area that we won't already have under the licensing parameters.
So those concerns will be taken care of in the
We-
license process
We put
and
them
does
all.
not
We
need.
put them all in the licensing process, just because it's a lot easier to deal with licensing than it is to deal with zoning.
Because you can pull the license.
You cannot renew the license, and no one has an argument about that. Well, anybody can always argue about what it is and appeal those decisions, but the special use permit process is a little different level of entitlement to it. So we were trying to look at special conditions that would justify treating somebody differently, not to use it as a mechanism that would regularly permit people through that. And that's how we thought of for single family homes. And when we think of the apartments, most apartment complexes are probably not going to have special circumstances unless they're in those lower density zones that we highlighted. We just don't see a project on Coconino that wants to have STRs. If we're going to allow them, what special circumstance would come up when you're amidst 14 other high density apartment projects?
How about that apartment complex on Lincoln and what is it, Highland, Sheldon, the newer one, which abuts
Oh,
the residential?
So they're in campus town zoning. They would have been exempt from it as well. With that said, there's some other factors that go into campus town about tax abatement and what uses are eligible for tax abatement or not. So there's some other questions in campus town that we would probably have to answer, but they're not zoning questions. They're urban revite questions.
So if I understand this correctly, then the thinking here is exempting these zones is based on character and sort of immediate
Likelihood of
surroundings.
being incompatible or leading
The
to
idea
a
being
decision
that-
or determination that it's an incompatible thing.
Yeah. Some level, somebody in a big complex is not going to notice this as much.
We've focused on the externalities of leaving the property, not the internal relationships. I'm not saying that every tenant's going to want in their building to have a short-term rental. I'm sure a lot of people aren't going to be thrilled to think, wait a minute, this apartment next to me isn't going to be someone that I'm going to know. It's going to be someone different every week. Landlords have to decide whether that's worth the economic benefit or not. You know, if you get a reputation as a transient property, it's going to attract a different set of tenants. So I'm not saying that a special use permit isn't justified. Our perspective was in the single family conversation, you could come up with circumstances where things were going to be different because of the conditions of the block or the neighborhood versus an apartment complex itself. Probably is not going to have that. But to treat everybody the same, there's always an argument for that.
Yes. So in this case, then the owners would have to come back for a special use permit.
They'd have to obtain one first. Yeah.
Before even the licensing could take
Yep.
place. So there's a
Yep. So
whole another
So
essentially.
the process for single family is you apply for the license. That'll give us the information we need for you then to go to the zoning board of adjustment for your special use permit. Once you have that, then you can complete the licensing process.
Would it be the same for apartment parcels?
It'd be the same. Now the difference here is all those apartments already have rental code certificates.
Mhm.
You have to get a rental code certificate to be a vacation rental in a single family home. So there's 3 layers in the single family home. The apartments already have that rental certificate. So that one's.
They would just need the
They would just
SUP.
need yeah.
Okay.
They would not need the SUP.
Well, if
It
we,
depends on what you guys
yeah, if we
decide.
decided to blanket it, they would.
Yeah. So that was the extra layer on the single family vacation rental was we're going to give you this privilege because you're going to go the extra step of meeting the rental code compliance requirements fully. And then we're just looking at the use as a special use permit, not whether the building is code compliant.
Maybe this is a hard question to answer, but like in a case like that for an apartment complex, let's say a larger one coming in, applying for a special use permit, what concerns might get raised by the ZBA that would stop that from being issued?
Well, some of your original comments were 30% of, let's say, a 300 unit apartment complex. That's 100 units. So if somebody could ascribe behavior to those 100 units that's incompatible with the surroundings, then they could say no. Now I would say, when has a 100 unit hotel been noted to be a problem? It's going to depend on if that's in a quiet neighborhood or is that on an arterial street, right? So you start to really look at this analogous to a hotel, and when is a hotel a problem or not a
But a
problem?
hotel always has staff on it. Our short-term rentals would probably, in this case, might not have anybody
It's
on
going to
site.
depend, right?
Yeah.
But we're not going to have
But just the
300
nature of
unit
them not being
buildings.
present would not be a reason to deny a special.
All the big buildings in the city that I can think of are on arterials already. They're not smack in the middle of a quiet residential neighborhood, are they? Or maybe there's a couple, but it's,
Large ones, yeah, they're going to be on bigger streets. So to me, that's when it would come up, is if you could come up with why transient use would be significantly different than regular residential use.
yeah. I don't know.
Well, if you look back at that table, you were saying the larger buildings would be more in certain zones, and that's documented in that table on page 2. In the lower density districts, you have
Yeah.
smaller building apartments, but you still have apartments
Mm.
in all the districts. So you can see FS, RM, and RM, those apartments are in bigger buildings. Actually, most of them are in 12-unit buildings, whereas 12-unit building isn't allowed or wasn't built back in the day when these other units were many of the ones in UCRM are single-family homes that were converted into apartment units. So there's a difference.
Right, but none of those would be exempt. They would all be coming before the ZBA asking for a special use permit.
That's our recommendation.
Okay, I don't know. Other thoughts? How strongly do you feel about this, Lonnie? The SUP for everybody?
It's more of a consistency issue in my mind,
Yeah?
and I feel like it's easier to track. But if the city feels that it's
I could go either way. I mean, I see your point. I think there's a
I
certain
do.
fairness to it.
I see your point, but I think if the licensing includes the content, it should still be trackable.
I don't think the special use makes it more trackable.
Yeah, that's my concern.
As
Was
long as we're
whether or not
because
that-
we're requiring, I'm
because you're
assuming we're
requiring
requiring
them.
licenses, you're gonna have to register the property, identify the units, and there's gonna have to be demonstration.
So that is in the
compliance.
licensing process.
It'll have to be if that's where we
Okay.
go with it, yeah.
if licenses, again, I'm playing the devil's advocate and probably getting too much into the details, but if licensing is anyways covering all the issues that we are concerned about and we think might be raised, then what is the special use permit doing additionally in cases where it is required?
One thing the special use permit does, especially with the single-family homes and so forth, is it gives a chance for the property owner to put it out there, and the neighbors are noticed. So they have a chance to come in and speak to the issue of this property being licensed as a short-term rental for vacation rental purposes. And so if you require special use permit in an apartment facility,
Man.
and you were noticing everybody within 200 feet, you'd be noticing possibly other apartment complexes and so forth.
Okay, so like going back to the example that I mentioned, because that is the only one that comes to my mind, and I don't know if there are others, like the one on Lincoln Way, which is between Highland and Sheldon, there's all of that single-family residential which backs up, abuts with the apartment complex. In that case, I see value of having a special use permit so that those neighbors are notified. I don't know if that kind of condition exists elsewhere. If there are any other instances in city where the complex abuts single-family residential, where you would need protection for that single-family residential.
The one further down Lincoln, before you get to the west side, Hy-Vee is also adjacent to single-family residential. One built on the old middle school property. But both of those buildings are the way they're designed are really far physically from neighbors. Right, the one at Highland you're talking about is it's internal, right? So you'd never even, I assume the neighbors would have no idea who's coming into that building at any hour of the day because the entrance is off Highland.
Can we expect any new construction of apartment buildings that abut single-family residential to follow the same design concept?
Don't know.
We can't.
Well,
I mean,
and-
We
not,
cannot. So which, again,
if in
to me-
Campus Town we could, but
I mean,
other neighborhoods maybe.
We've already cut the limit down to 10%. So are
It-
you
that's-
creating a solution for a problem that's not going to exist? I mean,
Which is why I was trying to figure out what's the difference with the special use permit beyond the notification. Is there anything else in the special use permit that adds additional
No,
protection than what's not covered in the licensing?
No, yes, but only in those unique situations.
Okay.
Your regular environment, it's not adding anything because there won't be a reason to differentiate one apartment complex over the other. If you're in an RL area and you have a 3-plex on one quarter, a 4-plex in the middle of the block, another 4-plex at the end of the block, and there's 6 houses on that block, and all 3 of those want to do this, that's a reason there's a special use permit. Is there an over-concentration issue? Because it's really a single-family neighborhood, not a high-activity, high-density area. That's why we're recommending the lower density zones get treated differently, the same as the single-family vacation rentals. Because we don't have a concentration standard, we don't have a separation standard. Because there was no way to come up with that basis for that kind of separation.
I'm fine with it. I'm not wedded to that.
I think his point, that we're already lowering this percentage significantly should
That'll help.
take care of any of these problems. So we can leave. So the only change you really want to see is the RL removed.
Yes.
Okay. So no RL at all, no SUP in RL. Okay.
Going back to that first one, I know we already talked about it, but it says home share as an accessory use permitted with no license.
Renting out your bedroom.
And that's all right. We don't want them to necessarily come down and get a license. The license is what is adding all of those, addressing those concerns. Does it matter that they don't?
Is that the same? It's the same for single family though, right?
No, single family, you do have to register because there's no other permit on file likely for it. So again, these are registered rental apartments. They've been inspected. They get visited every 2 to 4 years. Versus a single family home that's never been to the city for anything. We wanted a record that they were using it that way.
So by adding a license, this would mean any Airbnb, basically any short-term rental of any type would fall under the licensing process at that point. So whether you were renting a spare bedroom or your sofa, you would be required to get a license. Is that, if we were to remove that?
So if you're going to require the home shares to get a license, then you're probably going to have to push the licensing into the tenant's obligation than the landlord's.
Yeah.
And again, we don't want to be involved with who's letting a guest stay in their apartment
Whether or not they
for
pay.
3 days. Are they paying or not paying? I didn't pay. Well, then it's a guest, so it's not subject to the home share because you didn't make any money. Well, how do we know they made it? It's too much for us. It's either a yes or no question.
Could it still be treated like a parcel? Similar to the other where, we don't get into what kind, whether it's a home share from a tenant or whether it's a vacation rental that's offered by the property owner, but there would still be a license for that parcel.
I'm just not sure the city wants to be, again, involved in weekend tenant relationships with who's a guest and who's not. That's the main reason for avoiding that. Yes, every landlord could come in and register their property and say, well, I'm going to allow home shares on my project. Maybe we gain something if there's nuisance complaints, possibly, but I just don't think that we're set up to deal with 14,000 apartment units and their tenant home share relationships.
Does feel like significant overregulation.
Just don't think we're equipped or interested in doing that.
Yes, the expense would be outrageous.
It could be. Could be very time consuming for minimal benefits. So is there a consensus for a motion at this point?
I have a couple other questions.
Okay.
Do we have any other requirements that would be included in the ordinance beyond the table that we are seeing?
We didn't bring the licensing parameters back to you because it would be similar to what you saw last time.
Does that address how the property is maintained?
Nope, that would be the rental code. So again, they're still subject to the rental code. There's no extra property maintenance requirements or anything that go along with this.
Okay.
The main hook in the single family was that if you got certain kinds of nuisance violations or citations, the city could pull that license from you. The rental code doesn't have that. Rental code has property maintenance violations, not nuisances, or not like noise violations.
We're good. So, if I understand everything, we have the alternatives or for alternative one, these sub pieces, A stays the same, B changes to 10%, and C stays except for the striking of RL from the non-exempt list. Is that-
1 or 10%, whichever.
1 or 10%, sorry.
Yeah.
So somebody want to put that into
Whichever's
some
greater.
eloquent wording?
One quick clarification. We list FVR, which is village zoning. Village zoning is kind of unique and it regulates building types. So I would say we'd probably treat an apartment building in village the same because they're in a master plan. But we would look at that a little bit more closely.
Where is FVR?
Somerset's the only place that it is.
Okay. But not all of Somerset.
Yeah,
All of
so,
Somerset is
yeah,
FVR?
so the
Okay.
whole area is FVR. So
Okay.
all the single family, which has different building types,
Okay.
the mixed use shops and all that stuff is. So just wanted to let you know that when we look at FVR, we'll probably have to dig into that one a little bit more.
But it's a special use permit requirement right now anyway.
I'm saying it could be broken out that the large apartment buildings are not. But we need to dig into that a little bit further to see how that's split
But
up.
they're not separately zoned. They're all
in one
same
zone,
giant
but we
zone.
regulate things differently in that zone than any other kind of zone.
Okay.
Because you have to have a master plan that dictates how everything's set up.
Right. Okay.
Should I take a step?
You want to word it?
Take a
Yeah.
step.
It's actually not so bad.
You guys can fill in if. I would recommend option 2, which is that the Plan and Zoning Commission recommend a zoning text amendment allowing the expansion of short-term rentals into apartments in all residential zoning districts except in all residential zoning districts with the following modifications to the licensing requirements. Number 1, home share as an accessory use permitted with no license. Oversight compliance would be the responsibility of the landlord. So that's exactly the same as the first one. It's exactly the same as the first one. I'm basically going to go through the ABCD of the first
Control C.
recommendation and change it for the modified. So the first one, A stays the same. Number 2 being vacation rental as a primary use restricted to no more than 10% of the units in
Or
the
one.
building or project.
No,
And
one,
and
okay, go ahead.
I'm trying to frame how that one could be included. No more than 10% of the units or 1 unit, whichever is greater.
Mater,
Whichever
yeah,
is greater.
1 or 10% the greater of the two.
We understand. We'll write there.
You can write that.
You guys don't have
Okay.
to
You
write
get
it for
Okay,
us.
You get it. You get it, Natalie?
So there's 3.
Sure. And no more than 10% of the total number of units. That's the more important one. C, an exemption from special use permit would be applied by zoning district. And again, keep all of the ones in your C from the first, striking the RL out of the non-exempt. So everything stays the same except for that RL. And I will add D, which is no single family rental to be allowed for apartments located in the RL district.
Vacation rental. Vacation, not single
No.
family rental.
Yes. No short-term rentals to be allowed for apartment buildings located in the RL district.
That would
Yeah.
include home shares. So you have to be specific. Do you mean home shares and vacation rentals? So STR is an umbrella that covers the multiple categories. I think you're concerned about the
Reframe it.
vacation rentals. No vacation rentals within non-conforming apartment buildings in the RL zone is what you had said earlier.
So what Kelly said. No vacation rentals as short-term rentals. Do we need to specify that? No vacation rentals to be allowed in apartment buildings or apartment units located in the RL district.
What about E? Other rental licensing
D
requirements?
is just informational.
Okay,
It's just
that doesn't need to be in
Yeah.
there. Okay,
doesn't need to be stated.
all right. So it's been moved. Good job.
I will second that.
It's been moved and seconded. Any other comments? Please no.
Do you need to reread it?
No. It's been moved and seconded. As the record reflects, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. All right. On to number 7 on the agenda, the discussion of comprehensive plan kickoff.
Hey, it works. We have a new toy. So we can control the PowerPoints now. All right. So this item is really to give you an update on where we are in the comprehensive plan and to give you a chance to kind of walk through the exercise that City Council went through in December. And as we go through this PowerPoint, we'll talk a little bit about schedule. And then we do anticipate that you'll want to kind of have some of the discussion maybe the council had or comment on the outcomes of that meeting, if that's what you like. But really, it's going to be up to you guys how you want it, what you want to do. There's no actual action item from this tonight. So we had this meeting on the 18th of December. We had RDG, who is our planning consultant, present to walk through this agenda. We had a little bit of information about what a comprehensive plan is. Again, talk about the schedule. And then council really was focused on 3, 4, and 5. Part of this meeting was to try to pull out of the city council some of their interest for this project overall. They haven't had a discussion about their needs or priorities for the project since we had a discussion very generally of almost a year ago. So that was important for the consultant to have a chance to talk to the council. So if you're not keeping track of comprehensive plans, it's a term that we're using for this process. Currently, Ames uses an abbreviated version of a comprehensive plan that focuses on land use. So it's called the Land Use Policy Plan. To keep the conversation very open and very broad at this point, we're moving into what we're going to call Ames Plan 2040. And it's a comprehensive plan, meaning that it can cover issues related to livability. It'll definitely deal with growth and land use. It'll try to integrate policies related to open space and transportation and economic development, all kinds of issues that all kind of come together and are better dealt as cross-cutting issues than in silos, where you have one plan that says one thing over here and you have another plan that's kind of not interacting with another one on another side of the bookshelf. So a comprehensive plan, we don't have a format for it. That'll be a product of as we go through the exercise of understanding what people's issues are, what the visions and policies are. We'll get to a format later on in the process. So we're not stepping into this saying, here's the format, then we're going to fill in the chapters that match this. We're going to develop that later on in the process. So this is a slide that we used a year ago with the city council to talk about comprehensive plans. They have a lot of importance. In Iowa, you need one to have a legal basis for your zoning regulations. Your zoning is to be guided by a comprehensive plan. It also gives a chance for the community to participate in the vision for the city. It helps guide different kinds of decisions. And again, you have choices as a community about what you want to put in a comprehensive plan. The state of Iowa does not dictate to you what you must address. So we can tailor this to the interests that come up in this. There are of course best practices, and there are suggestions about what to address, but it isn't dictated to us. So it's really going to be a community-driven plan. When we were first discussing what we should do, there's a lot of different variations on this. Our last plan again was in 1997. This slide was part of the evaluation of how to go about this, and it was pretty clear to everybody that we were well beyond the scope of the 97 plan, and we were going to go down the route of creating a new one rather than just refine it or make minor adjustments. And this is just to help you remember that we did address this a year ago and said, yeah, we need to move into a new plan, not just try to modify what we have. So these, again, were some of the things that, if you look nationwide, issues that come up in some communities. Not every community is going to address this, but these are the kinds of topics that could come up during the discussion of formulating a comprehensive plan. So for planners, they're pretty common things. If you're not in the planning field, you may not hear about all of these things. Any questions on what any of these terms mean for anybody at this point? So in our RFP that we sent out to hire a consultant, this is how we defined to that consultant group the issues that we felt were most likely to be discussed. Things that aren't on this list can definitely come up during public engagement, but we thought this was a pretty well-rounded list. There's going to probably be themes or issues that we talk about on the left side of this slide, and then there's going to be the more technical data, which is stuff that we'll derive from our research and an evaluation of existing conditions on the right side. So the two things will get married together, and eventually you get to policies and discussion of what your priorities are moving forward when you look at the two things together. So the process is going to be quite lengthy. It's at least an 18-month process. This is a schedule put together by RDG to kind of help people understand as we move along, where are we going to be in this process? Where we're at today is January, and we're in this process with RDG of starting to pull the background information together, get a project website up and running. And what we've highlighted is that February 5th will be our first public kickoff meeting. So there will be an open house at the library on February 5th. We'll have an afternoon and an evening session as an open house where you can come in and see stations about different topics and plans that we have in the city. So you can kind of get familiar with things that we have done as the city. And then if you want to start to provide input as the public about issues or questions that you have, you'll start to be able to feed that to staff at that meeting. And then by February 5th, we'll also have a specific website tool up. We're going to have a combination of online engagement tools and then traditional public meeting and open house style to do this. One other thing that's going to be involved in February is working on kind of collecting what RDG calls focus groups. Those will be targeted groups that have a specialty or a special interest. It'll be anywhere from small business groups to neighborhood associations to economic development to health and wellness groups. So we're going to try to cast a broad net by topical interest, not just through public announcements and geographical approach to trying to find people to come to meetings. So hopefully that'll help broaden the involvement and get people at the table that have issues of interest. And then we can bring that again back together and kind of sort through how they go together or don't go together. So this won't be the only meetings that happen, but this is to try and help you understand where certain milestones are planned. The other thing that we know for certain at this point is April 2nd is very important. That is the next city council workshop. So the idea is that we'll be able to report back on initial public engagement, as well as bring some of this existing conditions report information back to council at the beginning of April. One of the main elements of this plan is to look at scenarios, and that is really to look at different areas of change in the community or around the community. Those are not yet defined, but that's a big step that'll happen after that April 2nd workshop, is to start to talk about where we want to focus our planning energy on areas that are likely to change. And this, again, as I said, it could be external growth, it could be redevelopment areas within the city. And as we start to go through the scenarios, we'll have to work concurrently then on what the topical issues are that we want to have as chapters in the plan. And all this starts to come together as a draft plan in about a year from now. And we start to review that as a document in its entirety after we kind of walk through certain issues before we write the document.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
What is the Design Studio One?
So RDG has that set up as that's probably one that's a little less certain how that's going to work. It's meant to revolve around those scenarios. So if we end up with a scenario that's a large swath of the city, you could have a design studio or a short charrette kind of dealing with what might be priorities for an area that you've identified as change. Maybe
public kind of
bring
in engagement.
Some element is a public engagement component where the public can come in and start to talk about issues in a geographic area within some framework that's been identified in advance. So at this point, again, that we're going to be trying to use different online survey tools. You can keep up to date with things that are happening. We're obviously going to keep putting every piece of information that's generated up online so people can track it and they can be aware of what's happening and when to participate as we go along. Any other questions about schedule or kind of these big elements of the work plan?
Just an aside, it would be useful to me to have a copy of this large general planning time schedule sent out electronically so that we could each have it.
Okay, not a problem.
The website's going to be a offshoot of the city website.
So right now there's cityofames.org is our normal website. The shortcut page is comp plan, right? I believe that right now the shortcut is comp plan, and that'll be a city page. And we're going to have certain kind of like document resources on the city page. And then there's going to be a separate web page hosted by a third-party vendor known as publicinput.com. And that's where we're going to run surveys and track different kinds of data by participants. So you'll get
But it'll all be driven through.
You'll get there through a city website.
Okay.
Yep.
Good.
So now we're walking into the facilitated part of the meeting with RDG. And these were the first three questions that they were asked. And I'm going to bring up the next slide and kind of go through what some of those comments were. They're just, as we just recorded the comments. So on these slides where we're telling you what was said, they're not prioritized. There's nothing like that behind it. It's just, this is the order that we received them, and this is the order that we're presenting them back to you. A lot of this is, again, we haven't had a conversation, but what does the plan mean to certain people in the community and what could it be used for? So that's where this exercise is starting to get to. So this was focused just on the process, not the plan, but what's the process? How do we know that we're going about doing this the right way? were there concerns that we were going about this the right way? Are there special interests or groups that you think might get missed that they thought should be highlighted early on for staff and the consultant to be aware of, so that we don't go too far down the path without a correction on what's going on? So I think with the amount of contact that we'll have with the council, so there's no steering committee per se. So city council is going to be asked to operate in that steering committee role. So we've talked about that some of the meetings where council's looking at this, they're not really wearing their city council hat. It's not a decision maker role. It's more about guiding the work. It's not about getting public comment. It's about guiding the work for the consultant and the planning staff, versus other times we're going to be delivering product and they're going to be making decisions about whether that is approvable or the direction that we want to go down, and receive public comment at the same time.
Quick question. Do you know how agencies or organizations and agencies would be represented or included? Like, how about SciRide and ISU? Is there a plan to get that input on?
So SciRide's viewed as a staff agency, so they'll be involved with any other department in the city
Okay.
about their issues. We'll have a special technical focus group with ISU planning staff and representing the institution. So the institution will be represented as their priorities as the institution. Now, they may be not willing to share or able to share everything that we want to know for the next 22 years, but definitely they'll have an opportunity to understand, to articulate their concerns, their interests, and see how they mesh with what the public's saying.
It'll also be a way for them to look at ways to integrate their comprehensive plan with the cities, because the college also has one. Yeah, so the integration of those two comprehensive plans is a challenge, but could be very positive.
It could be.
It could be. We need to be optimistic.
ISU faces the same situation. The plan is 25 years old.
Yeah,
Actually.
So I don't know.
it's a good time.
So within this question of the process, does anything jump off the page as you, or do you see something that you think that's not on the list that would be helpful for us to hear at this point in time? And that's kind of what I'm going to ask you on each one of these slides. Does it look representative of how you would feel you would answer these questions, or is there something missing?
Are these answers from the council?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I mean, personally, I think the university's missing from this list, which is
I would add hospital to it.
kind of shocking.
This is a process question, though, not.
Well, but I mean, the process, did the university and the students have, I would say that is a huge indicator of success. Were they involved? Did they have a seat
I
at the
think the
table?
background assumption, because I'd already told them we will engage technically with the university, was already assumed. So
Well, but as you know, engaging with the university planning staff is very different than engaging with the university at large. And so, especially the students.
yeah, and the students are not the university. So when I say the university, I mean employees of the university. Students of ISU are their own group. They're a different group that we're seeking input from.
Okay. Well, I mean, to me, it's surprising it wasn't mentioned somewhere as part of this, but that's just me,
That
My
would be my concern too. And
centric view.
I totally agree with you. And I think I'm hoping the technical committee or technical group discussions that you are planning to have with ISU covers it. But I'm hopeful for a much more engaged discussion with university and also with the hospital, I would say, to see where they are headed, what their student enrollment
And the
looks like.
public schools.
Right, with the schools too. So all of those, I'm hopeful that is going to be taken into account in a much more productive way throughout the process to get those voices heard and to include, I don't know how, I haven't seen the comprehensive plan with ISU, but look at what they are looking at, how the
What
university is
they're
going to
starting over
change,
too,
grow
right?
or not grow, and how that could be included.
Maybe you frame it in the language of large employers and influencers that currently exist in our community, e.g., university, public schools, hospital. That way, it's very inclusive in the process, but you don't eliminate anybody by not getting them on the list. That would be the other thing with inclusion of larger employers.
Yep, we have, again, we did
Again,
itemize everybody that we're going to.
Right, that's why I'm saying EG and
Anything else? Again, this is about process.
it's about process, I agree. I
Okay.
just want to indicate inclusion because we hear that so often. I didn't know, or who's making the decisions. And anything we can do to support that communication and understanding would be positive. That's all I'm saying.
That'd be the thing I'd be most concerned about, making sure most of the people in Ames know that it's happening. You know, I don't know
That's our
how you're
challenge.
planning on pushing that out,
That's our challenge.
Yes, it is.
because that's gonna be because there's gonna be people sitting back here in the council meeting saying, I never knew a thing about this. You know, it was not put out to me.
That will happen no matter what we do.
Well, I understand that.
Our job is to minimize that response as
That's
much as
right.
possible.
And, you know, just making sure everybody knows what's going on continuously.
So this is the last, same question, just the last few points.
Yep.
So the second question is a little different. And what do you want to see as an accomplishment of the process? Slightly different question. Kind of started to talk about what the document is.
Just a process question. Do you know if the council has actually seen a variety of samples of what a modern current comprehensive plan could look like?
So we did a workshop in August of 2017. Some of those slides earlier in this presentation were pulled from that when we were trying to decide what do you want to do for a project in terms of rehash or revise what you have versus start new. So we did review.
Because sometimes
Some
it helps to
different ideas.
visualize. That's all I'm thinking.
Yep. So we went through just in general, here's a community that did this. And
That's
and
all I meant.
their decision from that meeting was they didn't want to pursue one particular style.
Sure.
They wanted to start at the ground level and build up from there. And the last three that are on the next slide are efficient development timeline, get the plan done in 2 years, and a priority might be establishing priorities. I think what the common theme was, it's about the community, but I think the council's interested in having a clear vision that people can rally around, and it's an inclusive plan that there's a lot of buy-in as the community towards a particular future that's articulated in there. I think that was a common kind of theme that we heard amongst many of the council members is we want the document to kind of bring people together and have agreement on what we're doing and not be a collection of disparate issues that don't really reconcile each other. So if we can get to that, great. Again, we're striving for the best we can get. So that's where we're headed. Again, those are the ones that I just read for you.
Can
So
we
this
go
is-
back to number 2, please?
This one or the one before?
Just the one before. Did you need input on any additions we might
Yep.
like?
Again,
have?
everyone I put up here, any thoughts about what you see or don't see?
Okay. I mean, this is a good list, and the thing that it speaks a lot to creating that vision. I would also like to have some form of something that says that the one priority, the one thing that you would like the process to accomplish is to bring together different voices and different stakeholders and let the final plan be a representation of all of those voices. I'm not sure that if I can see any particular point in there that kind of speaks to that. So basically, which would go back to some of that discussion we had that we need different voices at the
A
table.
broadly shared vision.
Right, and you need engagement and representation. So the final plan needs to be representative of the broadest stakeholder group. something that speaks to that.
Wouldn't the second
Right.
one kind of do that?
Probably. I'm thinking more of the process of involvement of people. Not having like one vision and having everybody agree to it, but everybody coming together to build that vision together is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, the engagement question.
The engagement question,
Which is
basically. Have that representative somewhere, basically.
That's
And not have just one group hijack the whole process.
Yeah, which probably, with all of that, I think that would not happen, but it's just something else to add.
Anything else under number 2? So this is a little bit shorter list. What concerns do you have?
Hmm. It's- If I answer this question honestly, I would say having the council as the steering committee is my biggest concern.
That was obviously a very big decision up front, how to format going forward on this. And,
Yeah.
and if you don't follow the conversation at council the way I do, 'cause I'm there, there is a lot of concern about the 90s and how that plan was derived. So where you see comments about making sure one group doesn't drive the plan and that everybody's involved and that we don't go one route and then make a lot of changes afterwards. If you're not familiar with the history of the city's comprehensive plan from the 90s, those are all things that are viewed as missteps now. So that was very commonly echoed throughout this meeting of to ensure those things don't happen. And the council as the steering committee was viewed as the way that would not happen.
Did they talk about it being exclusive to council members or council members plus some additional representation in
There
that
is no
steering
steering
committee?
committee.
Okay.
There's no steering committee.
And this gets at the issue of voices at the table, truthfully, because when you,
And perception.
you don't have even other organizational entities and in that capacity, the process, how this unfolds becomes part of the politics of the city, which is, I think, from my perspective, at least as a citizen and also a planner, that's concerning. So, I mean, just to add to the list, I don't know, maybe they don't want this on their list, but that's
It leads off with the perception of a closed process. Even if that's not true, it supports that perception. But
yeah, I think somebody identified, one of them said micromanaging of the process, which is another thing that tends to might come out of a situation where that's the steering committee.
Yep. And we had to go through that just at that meeting, as them acting in this capacity.
Sure.
How much are you telling staff exactly what to do with just giving a general charge and then deciding if we did it well enough? So it's going to be a learning curve for all of us as we go along. But we went through that exact same discussion when we were talking about the focus groups. Again, was council going to write down a list of everybody we had to talk to? Or was staff going to be charged with, these are the kinds of topics we're going to address and we're going to find groups that will respond to that? And ultimately it got to, okay, staff has identified the kind of groups. Yes, we agree those are the kind of groups you should go meet with. And that was the final end of the direction, rather than bring us back the list of invitees and let's review it and we'll generate a list, which what a steering committee would probably.
Exactly.
So the
But a
steering committee
would be helpful
So the-
towards.
So the steering committee would be generating all that stuff, and instead councils have to decide what they delegate to staff and what they really want to direct. So that's where the micromanaging question is going to come up every now and then, depending on that.
I would echo the lack of a steering committee as a concern as well.
Okay.
I don't think there'll be a problem with it being, council having to slow down the process. Might be the problem having to speed it up a little bit or something, because it's going to be a slow process.
So the next 3 slides are, I think it's 3, maybe it's 4. This was an exercise that council went through where they were given, I believe it was 10 Post-it notes, yellow, and 10 Post-it notes, blue. And we had boards up with these 10 topics on it. And this was just a chance for them to write short answers down, go put it on a board, and then we collected the answers. So it wasn't a discussion of each one as someone went around the dais and said something. So you had to get up and go mark what you wanted. And you'll see that not every issue had as much attention as the other issue. So it was a chance for us to get a feel for, out of these 10 issues that we put in the RFP, where people feeling are really the things that they want addressed. So I'm going to say we're going to go through this. And again, I think you guys should have a chance to say these are things I would add to these lists, either strengths or challenges as we go through these. And don't feel that you have to have a strength or challenge added to all 10 of them, because they got 10 to use however they wanted. But this was pretty, at the end of this, it was kind of interesting to start to sort out again, where are people's priorities at the beginning of the process before you've had any public input beyond what your preconceived ideas are.
A similar weighted voting kind of activity with some of your subgroups and your community input would also be a balancing approach to ensure that you get community input on those priorities. And I'm guessing that your consultant will do something similar in managing those groups.
So there will be, it won't be exactly this. This was really
But
just
something similar, yeah.
Yeah. So there's going to be yes, there will be an attempt to try and gain input on certain issues collectively across all groups. And then other parts of it is just what are, again, free speech of what you think are issues to us. We don't want to put you in a box and say, pick from these 4. And that's what this was. We weren't trying to say, pick off this list. Tell us what you think they are. The topics were there just to help give you some sense of where to start. So as I said, the old plan is really a lot of it's about expansion of the city. So strengths and challenges that were identified about that. So I just want to make sure that nothing is off the table as we start this. So even though we have an old plan that talks about southwest, northwest, and north growth, we've already said that all of that will be revisited. We're not married to any of those prior land use policies. We'll be looking in multiple directions. So some of this stuff is guided by, well, we're going to be looking at expansion of the city in the year 2020, not as it was seen in 1997. And also about redevelopment. That's a later question, I guess.
So these are all things they wrote down
Yep.
in their sticky notes.
Yep.
And and you guys categorize them then based on like
They did, because they would, if
Okay.
they wrote on a blue note, it was a challenge. If it was a yellow note, it was
no, I meant like the subcategories.
Like
yeah.
those little-
So the consultant tried to group them so there
Okay.
was a little bit of commonality within them.
Okay.
If there was groupings, there wasn't always groupings.
Sure.
If some of those seem odd to you and you need context, I might be able to answer that.
At this early stage, it's probably not necessary.
Okay.
Will this documentation of this process be on the website?
It is right now.
It is right now. Okay, great.
So the summary of the December kickoff meeting with council is
Okay.
available on the website now.
So as a community member, I can go on there and I can see all those and,
Yep.
all right.
So if you go to
great.
that cityofames.org/comp plan, this is posted at a link on that page.
Excellent.
That page will get revised, but this will be there.
Seems like a few folks seem to perceive Iowa State as being part of the problem. or the challenge.
There's always a town gown tension,
Yeah,
you know,
I mean,
that's
it's just-
how it
it's
is.
But if you talk again, so this is expansion of the city, and you realize that south of Ames we can't grow because there's thousands of acres under institutional control. That's a challenge. You just can't grow that direction. So so in the context of this question,
I consider that a blessing, but anyway.
But it's a parameter
It
within
forces us
which
to
we've got to
rethink
live.
how we grow, not just an expansion mindset. Some of those artificial boundaries are beneficial, like having the South cut off, for instance. But
any other, so again, external expansion of the city, any thoughts missing? If not, I'm going to roll on. I'm trying to,
I feel like I need a little more time to react to some of this. This is the first time I'm seeing this and then running through all
so
of that.
again, this is
It's a
an
little bit-
overview, trying to
Yeah.
give you a sense of what,
That's why I
what they
asked if
went
it was
through.
online, because I'd like to sit down and spend some time with it.
Yeah. And then would there be an option to give that feedback after we've had some chance to look through this?
yeah, I think without an exact defined role on that schedule of what the commission's doing when, I think as a commission, you can definitely vote to ask for things to be on an agenda for discussion.
Good.
So I think there's times where I'm going to initiate it for you and say, hey, we just completed this task, or this task is coming up. It's time for you guys to look at this or to say something. But if you as a group want to talk about it, I think that's completely within your role. And you just have to say, we want to have a discussion item about the comprehensive plan on a future agenda, or say what date you want that to be.
If you give us enough of a heads up too on stuff that's coming our way.
So, yes. I mean, yes. I mean, there's, like I said, there's not an exact defined role all the time about what your involvement will be.
But it'll be
Right,
our
but
responsibility.
Yes.
Well, there's certain things we'll definitely bring, not just here's the final plan. I didn't see it for 2 years. Yes or no. That's not what we're going to do.
But it's our responsibility also,
But
though,
this
as
is a good
members.
example. So when we give the feedback to the council on the 2nd, obviously I'm going to review that with you
Sure.
after it's done, so you understand what was reviewed there. But just like this, if you want to discuss it in greater detail, and anytime you want to, as a board or as a commission, give direction or have a vote to say, this is our opinion about things related to this project, I think you should be doing that. But you got to act as a board to do that. It can't be
Individual.
John and Carol say this, and Carlton says this,
Yeah.
and Anu says this.
We're going to put on a board hat.
So I think, so for us to talk, that's all fine, but as conveying information back to council, and I think it has to be more as a board.
That makes sense. For now, I was just thinking, like, even with this, it would be nice to have gotten, like, even if I had seen and it's probably some of it is just me. I haven't looked at the website, what all documents are in there.
Well, you
If
wouldn't,
I had had time to go through it, I might be able to give a little more productive input tonight. That's all.
that's fine. And I said, we're just starting outreach February 5th. The idea will be throughout February into March. The April 2nd is a date we want to really maintain as reporting back. So you have more time to ponder this. And this isn't even exactly input. This is your first thoughts.
Yep.
So again, this was to try and help the consultant as much as anything, start to get a feel for the city council, because they don't have a relationship. I have a relationship with you. I have a relationship with council. They don't. So a lot of this was about them. And it is good for the public to start to see what's on people's minds. Okay, so I'm going to move to the opportunities for infill slide. One of the more underrepresented issues in the current plan is infill. It's not really acknowledged other than statements about downtown and a very broad vision of downtown expanding, and then reinforcing campus town. But other than those two things, there really wasn't a discussion about redevelopment or infill opportunities. Thoughts on any of these? So one of the tasks in this will be to give some sense of housing market and housing demand. And then we'll also we have an economist that's part of the consulting team, and they'll be looking at commercial and industrial demand to the best that they can. There's no true predictive index for this, but that is part of this, is to try and be market-based and understand what are the influences on the market that at least what we can understand. Whether we can control them or not is a different question.
The comment, there's just, it looks like just one bullet point, but about commercial, more commercial needed. That seemed to come up in a different slide too.
Which one is
Which
that?
one?
At the very bottom of the challenges, more commercial.
Under other?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just curious, like what that, if there was a broader conversation about what that meant or what.
There wasn't a discussion of each bullet point.
Okay.
So it was a collection of themes, and it was relayed back to them, and then council's going to get this too back as well. So I would hazard a guess that it's more retail opportunities in general.
Maybe
would be a
comparison to
common-
the growth that Ankeny has seen over the last however many years, and the real change that they've seen there with the commercial.
I didn't hear the beginning of that statement.
The nature in Ankeny, for example, and the really ballooning growth of commercial opportunity there.
Mhm.
There's a fairly stark difference between our two communities, and that might have generated that comment. That's all I'm thinking. I'm just off the top of my head.
I think it is very common for people to say they want more of what they don't have
Sure.
in commercial retail. So that comment in no way surprises me. I'm sure we'll hear that from the public repeatedly as well. Even when Ankeny did their comp plan a year ago, they had the same, we need more of this.
Did they?
We don't have it. Everybody wants something that they don't have.
I don't know if it fits in this one, but in the challenges side, maybe like on the challenges side, having a complete picture or backed by data of what the existing housing inventory is like, and what the future demand looks like. To me, that's always a question with all of the proposals we see, is not having a data backed idea of what do we have now, and do we need this more, or how much do we need more of. So having that data backed judgment is a challenge for me. So I don't know if that fits in here or someplace else or not.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Definitely think there is lack of affordable housing in this town. And I'm not talking even about, I might be a little bit out of touch with what is entry-level housing anymore. Because I haven't had to look at a house even for 20 years. But
This is where the challenge of data would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Identifying I think there's some notion of it, but
Yeah, we have anecdotal data, like, we are seeing a lot of signs which say monthly lease is available, or there's so much vacancy rate, which might not really be the case. You never know, it might be very less, but that's kind of the perception you have. So something that helps support so that future decisions can be also made in a much scientific way.
Okay.
then there will be problems with trying for demolition in the middle of town. Just like we ran into with the Lincoln Way corridor. near downtown.
It's very common, yes.
Oh, yeah.
So the
Yes,
corridor plan, so that's one of the corridor plans, a great example where we're going to use that decision because it's relatively recent as one of those backbone pieces of an assumption for the plan going forward. So where we identified focus areas in that plan for change, those would be carried forward as likely scenarios for infill development as we go into the next comprehensive plan too. But we're going to look at other areas also. It's not just those 5 focus areas that were in the corridor plan. And yeah, we'll see how people respond. It's what lens do you want to look at that issue through? So the city doesn't really address neighborhoods in a robust way in the current plan, but it's definitely something that's on the council's mind most of the time. So this was why this topic was listed.
I would say one of the, maybe it's a kind of related to some of the challenges that are missing, but one of them around how and sort of neighborhood relations between students and non-students is engaging students in meaningful ways in the city as a challenge. I mean, I know it's been difficult to get them involved outside of GSB, but I think I would look at that list and say that would be an important challenge that this plan could somehow maybe address, is how do you bring more sustained engagement between the students and the residents, the permanent residents. We saw this over the conflict around the change in the rental concentrations or in the campus related neighborhoods, and how to do that better. Because there's I hear a lot of burning resentment from students on campus right now about what happened. And I think it helped spark the Ames Tenant Union and some other little groups that have emerged. And so how could this process that's a challenge, but how could this process lead to some better outcomes around those relationships? And I think at the neighborhood level too, because that's kind of where a lot of the conflict emerges. So it's kind of touched on, I think, in the balancing student housing comment, and recognizing that near campus neighborhoods face different challenges. I'm not sure what outliers means, but
Doesn't talk about relationships though.
no, not really.
Talks about the mix of rental versus owner
Yeah,
occupied.
I think there's a positive that could come out of this around those relationships. Even getting students involved in neighborhood organizations, which they are not. They are totally absent from those.
But they're not excluded intentionally.
No, but
But they're not.
if you go to those meetings, as I'm sure you have, there's a sort of an insular mentality, especially in SCAN, about not having them part of the conversation. And so I think that there's some room there. It's an opportunity too.
For engagement.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely.
They put it a positive.
We can't forget there's 35,000. They're the majority of the city.
Not the majority.
You don't forget, but some people forget.
So, anything else under the slide? Any other thoughts on this list? So with transportation, you should understand if you don't remember this, that we are mandated to do 5-year transportation plans because we're a certain size, so the federal government mandates that. The review of the transportation plan will not be exactly what the comprehensive plan is about. It will be using the last plan, and the next plan actually starts this year. So we're going to be kind of bridging 2 transportation policy plans in the middle with the comprehensive plan. So the city's done a lot about complete streets and bicycle and multimodal facilities, as well as long-term network improvements, and that's embedded in a Public Works Mobility 2040 plan. So that's one of those plans that we'll pull a lot of information from to support the comprehensive plan. We won't be recreating that in this process.
The one thing that occurs to me is I don't see anything explicitly addressing the impact and interaction with both state and federal highways that impact this city, either that go beside us or go through us. And maybe that's addressed in your transportation plan.
If it's about the operation of the highways, it'll be in that federal plan. If you're talking
Okay.
about, is it a challenge to the city or an opportunity for the city, then it would be
And
beyond
that
this list.
that needs to be in this list, I believe, because it is a piece of it. You do mention the railroad up there, I believe.
So access to interstate
Yeah.
highway system and Highway 30.
Exactly, and how
Yep.
how the Highway 30 and 69 and how those interface and would impact the city itself, because those are external bodies.
Mhm.
That's
Is-
all.
Is Duff state?
69 is a state route.
Yes.
So Grandin, South Duff, or Highway 69.
I would say one challenge, maybe that's related to the walking, biking, is the maintenance of infrastructure, the bike ped infrastructure maintenance problem, especially this time of year. I think, that's not a I mean, it's kind of, I guess, tangential to a transportation
Probably not a
choice.
comprehensive plan issue.
Yeah.
That's something I'll have to say. That's not the level we're going to get drilled down to. Is our ordinance is about snow removal and public works priorities for pothole filling, and things along those lines. Those are
What pothole filling?
Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I think of this as maybe, I don't know, be an interesting place to surface an issue like that.
I think that's what comes out of the conversations with the Complete Streets Plan, and then with the Mobility 2040, when you start to talk about, I mean, really it's CIP issues, it's budget issues, it's maintenance investment versus infrastructure investment, and that's what the council does every year in the budget cycle.
Like right now. Yeah.
It's right now. So next Tuesday, if you don't like the CIP, come to council. Public hearing on the capital improvements program is next Tuesday. And say your piece.
But I haven't seen is on the transportation choices, there should be some engagement with the major businesses in town.
So we're doing engagement at the beginning that include businesses. That's about everything.
Correct, but transportation can be a big thing with the, the
That's where I'm saying we're relying on that plan that was adopted 4 years ago as the information for the structure of the 2040 horizon that we're looking at. And that they include large businesses and different freight users and all those kinds of things as part of their outreach to develop that plan. So they will be involved. They'll have an opportunity to say something along those lines if that's what they want to bring up as a topic. But like real specific engagement about how streets function or what's necessary for their operations is something that'll be really part of that, of our mobility plans rather than the comprehensive plan.
Okay, and then the railroad should be engaged in that part too, because,
And they
They-
are,
okay,
as much as they want to participate.
well, I have an opinion on the railroad, I
Right.
guarantee you that. But, it's been on and off them putting a bigger yard out east and connection with the north-south main line and an intermodal facility. That's been an on and off topic over there in Omaha for years. And, tried to meld that with us.
Okay. A little bit shorter slide. Any comments on this one?
It's interesting that there aren't any specific strengths or challenges that speak to either solar or wind power. I mean, they're kind of implied, but nothing specific here.
So that's not, depends how you look at that. That's not directly
It's not directly
city government
sustainability.
issue. Well,
Okay.
I'm not saying it's not sustainability. Ames Electric deals with that
That's
question in
the
their
only place where it would,
operations.
where it
Yeah.
might fall.
It would fall under URAB, which is the board that administers Ames Electric, which there's also 3 other power companies in the city.
Certainly.
So the mix of energy and the sources of
And
that
sources.
would not be a comprehensive plan issue.
Okay.
Okay, your shared sustainability coordinator with the university is a strength.
Is that not up there?
Mm-mm. Do we have?
It should be on.
So
Yeah.
one thing that's come up, I don't know where council will go with this, is they have asked a report back from the city manager's office about doing an assessment of the carbon footprint for the community as a whole. We've been doing this for operations of the city for over 10 years. And the questions come up, what do we have as a baseline or information for evaluating community carbon footprint? So council's is going to get information back about what it would take to do that kind of an assessment and whether they want to take that on or not. So for those of the RDOT practicing planners up there, which is 3 of the 5, health and wellness is a major national theme about embedding policies, promoting activity into the planning world. A lot of research has shown the benefit of the structure of the community having very positive health outcomes in the long run, and to not think of it as a medical issue, but to think of it as a wellness issue. Because so much, I can't remember the breakdown, but does anybody else remember that? Like the determinants on your health, the majority are coming from your environment that you're in, not your genetics, not your medical access. So on a national stage, this is a big push in the profession. And we've been ranked as pretty high up at a couple. We've kind of got a couple community recognitions as a very healthy community. But you'll see that didn't come out as a strong strength or challenge for us on this issue. So you can start to see this is where the priorities, it's a long list of things you could prioritize. This one at this point hasn't come up as a major priority.
Like mental health would fall under this, or
It could.
Is a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
I would say the parks and trail system in Ames is pretty up there. That would be one of our strengths. If I'm not wrong, we are above what is the threshold for the population that we serve.
In terms of like miles of trail.
In terms of parkland, and I'm talking, I looked at it a few years back. So we were over what was the threshold required to serve the number of people that live in this town. Obviously, the population's increased since then, but I would count that as a strength.
Sub-area planning, you could say, kind of ties back to infill in neighborhoods. Our current plan does break out different areas and went to more detail than it did for the community overall. So this is trying to get a feel for if we thought that's been successful or necessary or important to us going forward. Any other thoughts on that one? Okay. That should be urban fringe management.
You had a typo there, Mike.
Yeah. So if you don't think about this, but the land use policy plan is the policy basis for our Ames Urban Fringe Plan. So we do have land use planning in the 2 mile extraterritorial area around the city. Every once in a while, you've seen fringe plan amendments processed as a land use policy plan amendment. So the fringe plan has a 2080 agreement with it that expires in about 1.5 years with Story County. As I said, the fringe plan is an implementation measure of the current plan. So the issues of the fringe will come up. I'm not sure how much of a priority they're going to take, but they definitely will have to be addressed in the next plan. Whether they're to continue the current fringe plan or look at different strategies, I don't know, but it'll be something that has to be addressed. So with that, we moved into just one final question that was stated 2 different ways. One is, what should the effect be on the people of Ames? And the next one's going to be, what should be the effect of this plan on the community of Ames? So when you're thinking about the people, this was the responses. They were only allowed to give one answer. So that's why the list is 7. And then when you rephrase it to be about the community, you get a little bit different responses. And that was the conclusion of the meeting in December. So as I said, if you have an interest in an agenda item, you can ask to put that on for discussion, and we'll be happy to do that. And I'll obviously bring certain things to you that are coming up or have been done recently.
Is there going to be any, or maybe it hasn't come up yet, but discussion of urban design as an issue?
Didn't make the list that you saw in this PowerPoint.
Does that mean that it's not?
So again, this was just an initial response. Anything can come up during the public engagement step, and new issues could be come up with by you as well. So I think at some point before April 2nd, I think we should think about either at the beginning of March, maybe the end of February, depending on where a meeting lands. That you guys should probably have a discussion. We can walk through kind of some of the engagement questions that we've been sharing with other people and give you guys a chance to respond as a board and be able to forward that probably as a board recommendation to the council along with a lot of other input.
Okay.
Does that seem like
I think that would be
kind of get you on the same opportunity to bring up things that you haven't seen instead of just say, I'm stuck at this list of 10, and see how we're responding to other people as well.
I think that would be helpful.
So there's no steering committee, but council's going to drive
Correct.
the process of things.
So they've agreed to this process. And I think, and we had a lot of conversation about how we know if the process isn't working right. And I think I had to convince them that you are going to know because you have to touch the project every 2 or 3 months. And if you don't feel like you've heard enough at any point in time, you're going to redirect staff and say, we're not moving forward until you can accomplish this for us first. So at the end of the meeting, I think they said, yes, we agree to this process, knowing that if they don't like how it's going, they're in control of changing it. And I think that was one of the reasons why they wanted to be involved as the main decision maker and not have a steering committee do something for a year and then not like what that steering committee did or what they didn't do. So that was probably one of the more important conversations of that meeting, was convincing council that this is our proposal, this is the consultant's proposal. But if it's not working, you have every opportunity to change that or to redirect it as we're doing it. So, anything else on this tonight?
It's a lot of information. Thank you.
So it's, cityofames.org/comp plan. This is there. And by the end of the month, we'll have that publicinput.com page set up to start gathering input from the public online. February 5th will be that engagement meeting, and there will be some other activities as well that we'll start to put together as a schedule.
Cool.
All right.
Thank you. Item number 8, commission comments.
I have none. Thank you.
None.
Yes, I would like, when we receive the items for us to go over and stuff, you have a lot of acronyms in here. And I really had to go back and forth and go back into my other notes and stuff to understand what everything was talking about. If we could have a explanation for the acronyms in there.
So we should have done that. If we neglected to do that, that was not our intent. Probably because we've been so close to, you talk about the short-term rental stuff.
Yeah, short-term rentals.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a lot of them.
Yeah, that's,
The zoning district maybe part of it.
Yes, a glossary would be
Yes,
useful.
that's, thank you. That's what I was,
yeah. So
that's what I was looking for. That's the word I was struggling to come up
So yeah,
with.
we probably definitely took the take that we're very close to it, and that
Right.
that you had familiarity, which you probably don't have at the same level as
No.
us when you
At
have
least
a
I
meeting
don't.
every 2 months. So.
But,
So I'm sorry, that wasn't intentional. We would normally.
and along with any other agenda items we receive, when you start pushing acronyms, if you tell us what they mean at the beginning, which you did on some of them.
Mhm. And that's what we would normally do. If we neglected to do that consistently, that was,
But just like she said, a glossary somewhere so we don't have to flip back and forth all the time too.
so typically we would spell them out in the report. I don't think we prepare glossaries for different things. The zoning districts are different. We could have given you a page from the table of contents and you could have seen what all of that meant, but okay. We'll pay attention to acronyms.
Staff comments?
I don't think so at this point. You should have a very short meeting on February. Just jinx.
5th, did you put the agenda up? 6th?
That item should be on that agenda. That night is a council budget presentation night, so you will not be in this room. I think you're downstairs in 135. Is that right, Natalie?
That's what's on here, yes.
Yep. So you'll be downstairs. It'll be when you walk in, just turn left, and there's a small conference room there.
So will you give us more information about this at that time too?
I was not planning to. There's nothing more about this I can share with you. If you want to have a discussion item, that's possible. The next time I'll be setting an agenda item of my own will be at the end of February, beginning of March, where we'll take that as an opportunity for you guys to give input to pass along to the city council as part of the public engagement process. So if you want another discussion item before that, you can ask for that to be on the agenda.
All right. We have a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
All right. So we don't need to second that. Meeting adjourned.